Hello, I'm Evan Kirshheimer. I'm the Research Vice President for Omdia's service provider research business, and I'm here this morning to talk about fiber access, IP optical, and the increasingly important role they play in building out a digitally connected fiber-first world. First, I want to talk about the drivers for fiber, both access and the infrastructure that underlies that critical access. And suffice to say, first of all, we have to underline the importance of broadband. So Omdia sizes the market for consumer spend on service provider services, and what we find is about 62% of that spend is on broadband, whether fixed or mobile. While that doesn't always get the headlines at some of those digital services, which tend to be a little bit more interesting or sexier towards the right, without that broadband, which is increasingly high speed or even ultra fast, those digital services to the right, which enable so much of our economy, would not be possible. In fact, they're not just a direct, significant revenue driver for telcos, but they are technology enablers for better business. And in fact, B2B business is a significant driver for this. In fact, many standards bodies, including the ITU, find that 50% of productivity growth is down to digitization, and digitization has at its foundation, of course, quality connectivity. So increasingly there is a connection between quality connectivity, high-speed broadband access, and economic performance. And the COVID-19 crisis really highlights this in an extreme. Many of us were sent home, many of us work from everywhere, and many of us at home, both at work but also as a consumer at home, are placing increasing demands on the broadband network. And we would all agree that those services are likely to only become more important in the future, given the situation in the world today. So let's talk a little bit about some of these specific applications. You'll see in the lower right there I mentioned 5G, IoT, AI, private networks, and cloud. And what we found at Omdia is that in talking to consumers and in talking to enterprise, is that those are the applications that are driving demand for ultra-fast broadband and high-quality broadband with low latency and no jitter. And without that, I don't think that these applications would become relevant and would have become as relevant for business and consumers as they have today. Now, increasingly, as I mentioned, there's a trend toward high speed and also toward connecting that to economic growth. So what you see in the middle there is a chart that shows that by the end of our forecast period, so by the end of 2024 or early 2025, the majority or the average consumer broadband subscription speed will be over 250 megabits per second, and a large chunk of those subscriptions, over 60%, will be over 100 megabits per second. So what we've seen there is both a growth in terms of average speed and penetration of high-speed services into households and into businesses. And this is increasingly seen as driving economic growth. A number of studies from for example, from the European Investment Bank and from the ITU have said that a 10% increase in broadband penetration has led to a 0.25 to 1.5% increase in GDP growth. Doubling of broadband speeds also leads to incremental GDP growth. So that was the background to us working on our Fiber Development Index. So I'm going to take about 6 or 7 minutes to talk through the findings of our Fiber Development Index and the relevance in terms of how we should go about as a community of technologists in order to foster the development of fiber globally. So first, to introduce the Fiber Development Index. This is a very comprehensive index. We didn't just take account of speeds. So if you look on the pie chart, you'll see the different factors that went in to rating and ranking the countries, which were about 80 countries in this that were part of this study. The first one is high quality, high speed broadband services to the home. And what we did was we covered and took into account fiber to the home coverage and penetration. The same for business. And then towards the bottom, we were looking at the infrastructure side, how many mobile cell sites are fiber enabled and fiber connected. And then towards the left there, towards the end of the cycle, we took account of ratio of fiber backbone length to number of households, and also then finally the average download and upload speeds. And obviously when you're investigating and exploring and analyzing 80 countries across these criteria, there's a lot of diversity. But what we found, even though there's a lot of diversity within each of these clusters, was that the best way to understand this was to cluster the countries into three groups. Cluster 1, typically very highly developed broadband and fiber to the home penetration. Cluster 2, developed broadband countries, where there's a high level of broadband uptake, but not necessarily fiber uptake yet. And then cluster 3, which are typically emerging markets where the focus has been on mobile broadband access, and therefore there's lower fiber penetration rates. Now, inevitably, Cluster 2 countries will move to the right as they sweat their assets. Many countries in Cluster 2 have invested in previous access technologies such as copper. They're still in the ground, they still work, and the view is their fiber, generally the conversion to fiber, will be slow and generational, and they will move towards the right, inevitably, towards Cluster 1. Cluster 3 is interesting. They can take a couple different paths. The first path they can take is that they can increase access. That's non-necessarily fiber dependent, right? That could be mobile infrastructure dependent, which of course has some elements of fiber in there, but not necessarily as fiber dependent as building out fiber to dense urban centers and then extending it further. And what we see is a number of countries taking a kind of mixed mode where they move diagonally towards Cluster 1, bypassing Cluster 2 by combining increasing access as well as pinpoint fiber build-outs. So this slide really covers just a little bit more about what it means to be in Cluster 1, Cluster 2, or Cluster 3. Obviously, with the exception of China, Cluster 1 tends to be smaller, more compact, and very highly urbanized countries. Cluster 2 tend to be sparsely populated countries with existing access technology build-out that spans decades, and Cluster 3 tend to be sparsely populated and also slightly less developed, typically with a difficult terrain. But what's really interesting here is each of these clusters tends to have different government policies regarding fiber build-out, and we think government policy, national policy, is very important in this regard. Typically, if you're in Cluster 1, you have a very strong and coherent national broadband policy that's been followed through. In Cluster 2, those policies tend to be a little bit more politicized and a little bit less effective. And in Cluster 3, those policies have not yet necessarily been formulated. So when we look across the results, you'll see that Singapore, South Korea, UAE, China, Japan, and Qatar all form Cluster 1. Now what's interesting here is I spoke earlier about some Cluster 3 countries creeping up and going diagonally across up and to the right in that chart a couple slides ago. And we see some great examples here. For example, Malaysia, Ukraine, Kuwait, etc., where a combination of pinpoint fiber build-out and increasing access means that in some ways they're leapfrogging Cluster 2 countries. And then you might see a couple of Cluster 2 countries down there surprisingly behind those others in the Fiber Development Index, including the United Kingdom and Germany. Of course, two countries with advanced tech sectors, but who also have well-established copper networks. And again, as I mentioned, sweating the assets tends to be their focus. So if we just step back and think a little bit about the applications that are driving ultra-fast broadband, the results of our Fiber Development Index, I thought I would spend some time talking about emerging trends in fiber access, and then also, all right, we know we need to build out more fiber. We need to convince the service provider community that this is important not only for their own bottom line, but for nation building and for the betterment of society. So let's look at some of these trends. The first one is the shift to quality of experience over speed. So you'll have seen from a previous slide that speeds are increasing relentlessly. And as speeds increase, the marketing power of just marketing speed as something that a consumer or a business should buy into is losing its potency. And our digital consumer insights surveys revealed that actually consumers are beginning to value other aspects that we call quality of experience, or QoE. Those include reliability, great customer service, a great Wi-Fi experience in every room, of course fast speed, but easy and quick setup. So what we see is service providers rounding out their approach to marketing ultra-fast broadband, de-emphasizing speed a little bit, and thinking a little bit more holistically about this quality of experience. So I will talk a little bit about what that means. And some of the advantages that fiber offer to improve quality of experience. So what you'll see here is our average network KPIs as gathered by our metrics partner Medux. And what they show is that the use of fiber leads to increased KPIs and therefore a better customer experience. Not just in terms of download speed, which is the big orange bar on the left there, and upload speed, which is the second set of bars, but also in terms of reduced latency and reduced jitter. Now, many consumers won't know what latency and jitter are, but they will know when their films, when their games don't perform to expectations. So it's quite clear that fiber is the underlying architecture and technology that can deliver this improved quality of experience. So what are we going to see in the future? Well, things are going to get faster. And again, if we think back to cluster 1, cluster 2, and cluster 3, what we expect in cluster 1 is typically ubiquitous household broadband penetration, almost ubiquitous ultra-high speed fiber to the home penetration, at least 1 in 5 households on gigabit services, and a very high average speed of over 360 megabits per second. Cluster 2, it's still going to be very fast. So a large percentage of households broadband benefiting from broadband, and a significant chunk of those from fiber broadband, as well as a small number on gigabit services by the end of the forecast period, still delivering over 150 megabits per second. And even in cluster 3, while we won't see that many on gigabit services, what we will see is fiber to the home increasing to almost 50%, I mean over 40% at the end of our forecast period of premises, which is kind of remarkable. Right, so these are some of the trends that we should look for in fiber, but it's more than about access. We all know the need for great access, but how do you get there? What is the infrastructure investment that you need to make in order to obtain that great access? So here are some points on that. The first technology and standard that I would emphasize is the importance of IPv6. We are quite simply running out of IPv4 addresses. IPv6 has started. It is now has started adoption. It's now mainstream. I mentioned IoT, 5G previously. The number of addressable devices will skyrocket, and IPv6 is the standard that can handle that. Many governments and national bodies have begun to formulate policies which have been quite successful at recognizing the importance of IPv6 and encouraging industry uptake of IPv6. It's very important to get ahead of this, to embrace this, and to work for service providers to work with their enterprise clients and their consumer services partners and consumers in order to roll out services which roll out IPv6 to support future services. Just to emphasize with some statistics, the number of connected devices that we expect for different applications. Look at the cumulative aggregate growth rate across, for example, industrial IoT applications, going from 227 million to 776 million addressable devices. We're adding almost 3 billion 4G and 5G global mobile connections over the forecast period. I don't want to go through all these numbers, but suffice to say, without standard innovations like segment routing v6, BIER v6, APN6, it would be very difficult to offer the increased functionality like network slicing and other industry critical applications, and therefore we see IPv6 and IPv6 Plus as essential infrastructure build out for a future ultra-fast world. I want to also touch on the importance of AI in the telco network. When we talk to telco executives, they tell us that they've done a pretty good job controlling CapEx, but they're struggling with OpEx. And in fact, network operations is currently consuming 20% of total operations costs for the telco. Any technology that can reduce or make network operations more efficient, especially as new fiber networks are built out, that's what telcos will be looking for and should be looking for. And our survey tells us the same. So these telco execs tell us that reducing operating expenditure, increasing operating efficiency are two of the three top priorities for them in terms of network build-out. And AI plus fiber can hold some of the keys to answering and addressing these issues. So what do we mean by autonomous driving networks? So the first thing is to think about the phases of network rollout. First is deployment, speeding up time to service and reducing manpower costs, for example, with remote or automatic deployment. Provisioning, increasing service agility and increasing customer flexibility. Self-provisioning is going to become an increasingly important both in the consumer home but also out on the street as networks are stood up. Again, using AI analytics to understand where there might be an issue in advance of an issue to prevent an outage. This will increase quality of experience and also reduce the number of truck rolls to support the network. Troubleshooting, rounding it out, understanding what consumer needs aren't being met, what business needs aren't being met, and converting support needs into new revenue opportunities. So some conclusions and recommendations, given I've had a very short time to spend with you this afternoon. First of all, it's quite clear from numerous economic studies that broadband is essential for future GDP growth. The second conclusion is that without fiber, we're not going to get faster broadband. So therefore, fiber connectivity is essential for future GDP growth. Providing that fiber build-out, which might not necessarily be inexpensive, right? It's generational for some of those countries in Tier 2 where they've invested for over 100 years in existing networks, right? Without IP optical and AI investments, the fiber rollout would not be as efficient and would not lead to the cost savings that they could. So please consider IP optical, whether IPv6, and also self-driving networks as important components. The other things to emphasize are that not all countries are equal. So you saw a slide with about 80 countries in it, and I did try to cluster those countries into 3 groups. But it's really important to understand that aside from the general principles I discussed for each cluster, that we need to take an individual approach, country by country, understanding the legal environment, regulatory environment, and the development environment in each country. Needless to say, there are specific and particularly 4 principles that we think hold everywhere. The first principle is that a national broadband plan is absolutely essential for success. Countries with national broadband plans that are coherent are already in Cluster 1, and we think that's been a major factor. Addressing the needs of society, of business and consumers in terms of ultra-fast broadband access and the infrastructure that supports that is not possible without government interest, policy support, fostering the development. Part of that is removing access barriers. For example, ducts and buildings. Regulation needs to be built in order to enable carriers to gain access to roll out the fiber where it's needed most. Financial incentives could include taxation, development funds, public investment. This is not necessarily going to be met purely by the private sector. And the final point is getting the service providers to work together. No use rolling out redundant infrastructure, which is already expensive enough. It's important for access to be granted between service providers to each other's infrastructure. So with that all said, I would like to thank you and conclude for your time. It's been absolutely a privilege to present to you. Take care and enjoy the rest of the conference.